Yep. Look, we are live on YouTube here. Whatever you want, but
Because there were problems before and
we are live on YouTube here. Whatever you want, but
because of the problems before.
We are live on YouTube here. Whatever you want, but we are live on YouTube here. Whatever you want. We are like whatever is more. We are like whatever is more.
Por causa do técnico, o vivo não é fácil.
Sorry, are there going to be any PowerPoints?
PowerPoint? I don't know, maybe. I think
Okay.
no, no. Então, além disso, vai dizer que o que eu posso explicar mais? Uma branca. Sim, sobre a agricultura, e és o diretor da Boa História. Tem que ir à procura do processo. Evidência. Tem que ver o que é que eu tenho no gabinete. Eu acho que temos que começar mesmo.
Chamar o Toby, não. Toby. Toby, perhaps you should come here. It's connected. So everyone is hearing us. Okay.
Yes. And seeing us.
I just want to get
I can sit down in the first row and if
Yeah,
there's
we have
anything-
okay, so you can. That's just. Relação, sim.
Eu posso falar com o Toby, que assim vocês têm os dois mais.
Eu chego mais para aqui. Se eu quiser.
Lá, eu estou com pena.
Sim. Okay. Thank you all for coming, for being here. Not only those that are in the room, but also those that maybe are seeing this through the YouTube channel. This is the discussion panel of this symposium. So it's a kind of a round table. We have 5 participants, Katia Antunes, Toby Green, Francisco Betancourt. They are all here at the table. And we also have Tiago Saraiva, Sujit Siva Sundaram, and Tiago Saraiva. That's it. So 5 people. So we haven't exactly fixed how this would be, but I suppose that we have 90 minutes in total. So if we save, let's say, 30 minutes for an open discussion, we are left with 60 minutes. We are 5, so it's simple. It gives us a mean of 12 minutes for each one. So I would suggest to organize this in maybe 1 or 2 rounds, and then an open discussion with the people that are here. That would mean, I would say, if possible, we would have a first round in which each of you would use, let's say, 5 minutes or something, just to underline the main points concerning the big issue at stake here. And the big issue is the environmental impact of the Portuguese Empire, of colonialism more generally. So if that works, we could have a second round, a short second round in the table, just for the first short comments, and then we would open the floor to all of those that want to participate. Do you agree with this? It's okay. Tiago and Sujit, are you?
Yes.
Okay, it's okay.
Yep, all good.
So I think we could start with Sujit. Could you please
Yes.
start? Is okay?
Yeah, that's fine. Thank you very much for this opportunity, and thank you to Francisco in particular for inviting me. I'm really sorry not to be there. I was looking forward to meeting Portuguese imperial historians. But I look forward, and I have been reading some of your work, and I look forward to reading more of your work in the time ahead. And I'll catch up with Francisco in Cambridge after the strike as well. So I'm not a Portuguese imperial historian, but I think there are 2 ways in which I'm going to be engaging with the topic of this conference. The first is because I'm writing a broader environmental history of the Indian Ocean through time. It's a synthetic overview of the environmental history of the Indian Ocean. So I'll be sort of using a little bit of the material from that book, which is still in progress and very early in gestation. And the second way in which I'm engaging with this is because I'm about to sort of launch this ERC-funded project on the long history of the city of Colombo, which is the present-day capital of Sri Lanka. And of course, it was once a Portuguese foothold. So I have a series of slightly scattered thoughts, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to organize them around 2 keywords in the title. The first is impact, and the second is environment. So firstly, impact, which actually is a big word for a lot of UK historians. We are somewhat scared of this term because it's used in ref assessments, but I won't go into that. Actually, one of the things that immediately comes to my mind when I think about impact in environmental terms these days, partly because I grew up in Sri Lanka, is what's going on in the city of Colombo right now. You can look online and very easily find images of this, and it's quite extraordinary. It's a $15 billion Chinese state-funded port city development project. And what's going on is that Colombo is expected to double in size, and land is being built in the sea to make it a kind of key site of transshipment in the period ahead, with the rise of China and in this new geopolitical arena that we're facing at this point in time. So it's really a kind of extraordinary example of environmental change in the global south. But really, after kind of thinking about it and looking at it out of, when I was in quarantine, for instance, I was looking at this project out of the window of my hotel. And what struck me was that actually it's a project that's inherited out of layers of engagement with the city of Colombo, Portuguese, Dutch, and British. I've written a little bit on the story around 1900, which is a British story. And there were some projects in that period to build breakwaters in the sea and to calm the sea and to allow this city of Colombo to become a key site of transshipment for the steam trade. And I think the visual kind of images, which are also online, if you put in breakwater, Colombo, British, are very similar, kind of uncannily similar to what is going on right now with the Chinese project. However, I would say that actually this is a project that has even deeper roots, because what happened is the Portuguese were very invested in building a lake, which still exists in Colombo. It's called the Beira Lake. And you can also look at the Beira Lake online. It's a very heavily polluted tract of water. Recently, protesters in the 2022 protests in Sri Lanka were dumped into the Beira Lake, violently so. And this is a sort of body of water, which is, attempts have been made to clean it, and, various things have happened with it over time. Hotels have grown up around it. A community of people who wash clothes, the Dhobi community, actually have worked on adjoining this lake, the Beira Lake. And of course, the Dutch then built canals as well as the British building canals. So in a sense, the story is of this wetland in the southwest of the island of Sri Lanka, which by the Portuguese, then by the Dutch, then by the British, and now by the Chinese state, has been repeatedly engineered through all kinds of infrastructural projects to become a city and to become a stable city where the water and the land can be separated out. So in some ways, the lake building, the canal making, the breakwater making, which is about controlling waves of the monsoon, and now the Chinese project of dumping sand in the sea are really part of a really long history, which is layered in so many ways of imperialism and capitalism of various kinds and geopolitics of various kinds as well. However, if you look at Gaspar Correa's 1518 image of Colombo, which is actually believed to be the earliest visual image of the building of the city, or of the origins of the city of Colombo, when you look at that Portuguese image, it's actually just like, it's just a fort, a factory, which is on a rocky outcrop from the land. It's actually kind of divided by a waterway, which may be the River Calonia, from the mainland. And there's a small bridge that links the fort to the interior. And so it was actually, in many ways, an unstable early settlement. And Zoltán Biedermann has been writing on this period of Colombo's history. And he actually argues that it was necessary for these settlers to form alliances with indigenous women and to form a stable kind of community. And for the fort, was abandoned, rebuilt, etc., in various ways for it to actually take hold. So in some ways, it's contradictory, because on the one hand, it's a very unstable outpost, which has to be sort of localized in various ways, environmentally, I would suggest, as well as socially. But really, its effects in the long term were quite transformative in the template that it set for the empires that followed. and also what is going on in Sri Lanka today. And so it's really that contradiction, which is really interesting to think about. I mean, how could it be so unstable and dependent on all kinds of local contexts, environmental as well as social, but also having this long-lasting effect. So here I kind of jump into, still with impact, into the Southwest Indian Ocean, where I have been looking a little bit at the Portuguese rounding the Cape of Good Hope, Vasco da Gama, of course, but also Cabral. They're hungry for spices, and they're very captivated in the Southwest Indian Ocean and on the coast of East Africa by the story of gold. For instance, Sofala, Hilva, but also this interior kingdom of Manamapata, which is imagined as sort of flowing with gold in the Portuguese mind in this period of the early kind of explorations. Now, there are different ways in which that story has to be contextualized, also a bit like what I was just saying in relation to Sri Lanka, with respect to what already existed, Islamic networks along the coast of East Africa. After all, the first Portuguese man who arrives in Sofala is disguised as a Muslim in 1490. And of course, the story of all these indigenous aides who assisted the navigators. So the way you have to find your way across the sea depends actually not just on Portuguese expertise, but also these alliances which are forged with indigenous aides of various kinds. But there's a more fundamental way in which the local context matters to this story. And that's because metal is already collected by Southern Africans for various symbolic purposes. And metalworking in Southern Africa has a very rich set of symbolic repertoires attached to it, from the sexual to the spiritual. And actually, there's a very different system of value attached to metals in Southern Africa. Copper is very valued, iron is valued, and then of course the Portuguese are hungry for gold. So really what you get is a really fascinating mismatch between this Portuguese kind of hunger and sort of myth making about gold and, you know, Great Zimbabwe's Prester John, etc., etc. And really what is going on, which is a whole series, and this is actually drawing on the work of archaeologists who've been doing fascinating work recently on Great Zimbabwe, but all of these hilltop polities across Southern Africa, where stone structures are found with stone terracing, and where communal forms of authority are linked to metalworking in this landscape. So really, what I'm trying to kind of highlight is that, yes, the impact can be transformative in the long term, and certainly, you know, gold mining becomes a really, really important kind of environmental story in Southern Africa, as we know. If we think about the 19th century, and you know, people who looted Great Zimbabwe, no one less than Rhodes is involved with this. So you know, it becomes a really big story of mining and environmental transformation, environmental degradation. But its origins lie in this sort of gap, this misunderstanding, this need for, you know, local context, two different value orders of metal here meeting, at least two in Southern Africa.
Sujit, thank you. I think that
That's enough. Yeah.
is enough. You are stressing the importance of the long-term impacts, of long-term views of the environmental impacts. So I will ask now Katia to present us her ideas.
You said
about
5
this.
minutes. So you said 5 minutes.
Yeah,
So I'll keep it
please.
really at 5. So I will not react directly to some of the points made by Sujit, but I think I'll try to start with 3 points and then try to explain why I think they matter. I think the first point is that reciprocity between environment and people outside of the environment needs to be seen from the point of view of the historical actors themselves, rather than of what we perceive now to be the environment and the environmental questions. So I think the first suggestion I would make as an historian is that you question historical sources and the worries of the people in the 12th, 13th, 14th, 15th, 18th century about their environment, not about our concerns about our environment. I think this is particularly important because environmental challenges in the 12th century are radically different from the 17th century or from the 20th century. It doesn't matter where you are, and it doesn't matter the typology of political systems or political economies or social fabrics that you may have. And in that sense, I think I would like to raise the question why empire actually matters when we're looking at environment or impact of environmental change. It has not thus far to me yet been sufficiently demonstrated that empire actually matters. So that would be my first point. My second point would be that we also depart from the principle, particularly in the revisionist turn in historiography about empire, that European empires have done things. And things are resumed I think the last few years, to violence in all types of forms and shapes, discrimination in all types of sorts and shapes, and the idea that these constructions are ever evolving and thus expanding, as if European empires were in a path dependence destiny of becoming whatever imperialism has become. What I find interesting here, regardless of where I stand in that debate, is that we have landed empires that accommodate 2/3 of human beings and environmental ecosystems that never cross the water. So I find it particularly interesting that most of the research and of the interest is actually centralized on maritime frontiers. I mean, Sujit is interested in Colombo. This is not by chance. People are interested in Southeast Asia for a reason. People are interested in, ports. We've heard about ports. We've heard about islands. Actually, we have heard nothing about the steppes. We don't know what is the impact of the Mongols in the disappearance of whole civilization of the Xiongnu, for instance. So we are very focused on the maritime shores because we kind of perceive that those are the areas of contact between peoples and ecosystems. And because of that, we perceive, and we hardly ever demonstrate, that from these interactions, there will be impacts that we perceive still don't demonstrate all the time that they were negative. So I wonder, once we extricate ourselves from the maritime experience, usually European, to a certain extent Ottoman, what happens then to the relationship between empire and environment? I wonder whether the expansion of the Chinese Empire, the Mughal Empire, or the Persian Empire would actually, or, the Ashanti in Africa, would actually turn around our ideas about the relationship between empire and environment. And my last point would be that there's two very interesting Africanists in my view that have studied the Horn of Africa and the Sahel region, Rémi Devière and Derese Wojciechowicz. And they make a rather interesting argument that the Little Ice Age had a huge impact in the Sahel and in the Horn of Africa. And the reason why this is the case, and I'm happy that you're saying, is that because of environmental constraints that have very little to do with imperial expansion, you have a huge movement of population towards north, towards the Sahara, and actually this is going to play in favor of the troops of Al-Mansur that are actually departing from the Maghreb to the south and then to the east. And actually they conquer large swaths of Africa so from the Maghreb across the Sahara, into the Sahel, into the Horn of Africa. This is a huge expansion. There's no European power that actually did this in such a short period of time. And here it's not empire that starts its expansion, it's environmental pressures that start expansion. Probably Al-Mansur would never be able to have done such a feat without the mercenaries or the people that were actually being pushed out of their lands in the south. So I would like to create, if you want to, what if situation where we need to look beyond the frontiers of the ports and of the maritime expansions that are usually traditionally associated with the Europeans and with the Portuguese in particular, and see how this relates to landed expansions, because then we can perhaps start to reconsider whether actually empire matters in terms of environmental impact, or whether empires are actually also drivers of constraints that actually shape empires in many ways. We were just, as a joke, talking about the Dutch conquest of Luanda. They're there for 9 years. That's a very funny way to look of how environment can actually just break an empire down. And this is a very anecdotal story. And really to close, I think that it would be also for early modernists, and modernists perhaps added value to listen to and read into what medievalists, particularly in Great Britain and in Ireland, have actually written about pre-industrial environmental changes. Again, particularly Bruce Campbell has been amazing in trying to feature the global history of environmental change from the point of view of a medievalist that is slightly different than what you would expect from early modernists. And he goes back to the idea that Malthusian societies are far more vulnerable than what we tend to portray them, even in the ages of mercantile capitalism and the age of expansion. And I'll stop there.
Thanks, Katja. I enjoyed very much your talk, especially because in the fact that you have tried to go beyond not only the Portuguese Empire, but also the European empires at large. And that was precisely one of the questions I was looking for answers. So now we move to Tiago. Is okay? Tiago, could you speak now and use your 5 minutes or so?
Sure, thank you. And thank you, Francisco, for the invitation to speak here. It's really a pity that I can't be there with all of you. It's I think like a really nice gathering of scholars that I would like to engage on a more sustained way. And I'm speaking as a Portuguese in Philadelphia, and I'm saying this because my experience here in Philadelphia in the last it's now 10 years, I think actually changed my perspective on how to think about Portuguese Empire, and that might be helpful for discussion here. And namely, one of the things that my colleagues here are always asking me about, it's how to relate the Portuguese Empire to the Black Atlantic and the Black radical tradition. So I will organize my my few minutes just around those issues, and how I think that can actually be a very productive dialogue with that tradition. And the tradition that, for example, in the works of someone like Cedric Robinson, in his famous Black Marxism, looks at the Portuguese Empire with a very strange lens, I would say, for most, at least strange from the point of view of Portuguese historiography, where he considers Portugal no more than just a metaphor. And it starts from there, and then we could discuss if the actual accuracy of the notion of Portugal as a metaphor. It has that effect of making the Portuguese Empire into a strange thing, into denaturalizing, the Portuguese Empire, which I think it's really helpful. And the other one obvious consequence of engaging with that kind of literature is bringing to the forefront all the experiences of not only of Black people, but of Maroons. So Maroons, I think that the issue of Maroon ecology is like maybe one of the most promising fields in in some kind of attempt of decolonizing Portuguese historiography of the empire, and there has been work done on this already. So it's a pity that Gabriel Rocha was not able to join us. Gabriel has actually already worked on that in very interesting ways. I think also there we have the recent work by Marta Macedo on cannabis, or the stories of black rice that we have there. Also David Carmo and his colleagues that have explored these, and it's not just around concrete material artifacts, that we can tell these stories like cannabis or like the rice, but also that all ecologies, and then one of the ecologies that I think has huge potential, and it's obvious that there is something there. It's around marine ecologies is the mangrove. So these are not the ports, and these are not the ports that Katia Antunes was mentioning. I think there is another ecology there, the one of the mangrove, that really needs more exploration. Of course, Toby is also there, and he will speak after, and he has also taught us some stuff about that in West Africa. And my engagement with mangroves, so very recent engagement with mangroves ecology, comes namely from considering how to engage with with decolonization and with liberation movements in Africa in the 20th century, and particularly with the story of Amilcar Cabral, and how to understand his own, so another member, of course, of the Black radical tradition, and that actually to understand his very political views, or his very same understanding of what constitutes the Portuguese Empire, mangrove ecology again comes to the forefront in the form of an attention to where rice is produced in mangroves in Guinea-Bissau, and how it describes how Cabral describes several environments in relation to colonialism and to concrete colonial practices, and so how to distinguish rice production in mangroves from peanut production, for example. That's I think a very interesting way of understanding colonial practices, and of challenging, what does it mean to be colonial? What is colonial? And again, picking up, and this will be my last point, picking up on the Black radical tradition, a very it's a challenge. So it's what this also means. What this also means, this unfamiliar way of looking at environment and colonialism, is the ability to look at the very same territory of the metropole of Portugal as a colonial space in itself. So it's not just that how much the colonial project is produced the Portuguese state, but it's also the Portuguese territory itself as a colonial space. And so here, where practices in Africa or practices in Brazil are actually fundamental to understand long durée trajectories in Portugal, cases that are more or less obvious, that have a long tradition also in the Portuguese geography, but not seen from a colonial history perspective, which, like, I'm thinking here of the story of maize or American corn, the famous green revolution that's treated by Orlando Ribeiro and so on, but never, which every Portuguese historian knows about that and quotes those things, but never explores it as actually that's a colonial history there. And there is through maize, one is actually able to tell a different story of Portugal as colonial history. What kind of colonialism comes attached with maize, and how can we talk about settlement of different areas of Portugal on a long durée basis through these through stories of maize. That's the kinds of things that I'm thinking about. And for more contemporary concerns, I can quote other examples of other major environmental changes in the metropolitan territory that we can't understand without imperial history. The case of eucalyptus would be another one. And I will leave it here. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you, Tiago. I think your talk and your views here bring the issue that we are discussing here to a more closer period. I mean, not only the early modern as up to now, but to a closer period, and also to a question that I think we could or should discuss, and it is, how can we compare or separate the historical and scholarly approach to this topic, the environmental impacts? How can we compare or separe this view with the claims of people that perform as activists, environment activists? So we can approach this issue in different terms, as a kind of a civic intervention or as a scholarly approach. And this is the kind of topic that is where it's easy to sometimes to make overlappings between the two approaches. So, but now we can move to Toby. Toby, please.
Thank you, Jose Vicente, and thanks, colleagues. Well, we were given 5 minutes, but so far nobody has kept to that, but I'm going to try to be briefer, partly because quite a few of the themes that colleagues have already discussed were ones that I had in mind to discuss. So I might try and relate some of them together. The theme of environment, and yes, Katia, there will always be environmental challenges, and that's true in any generation, and of course they're different. And I think as a historian, clearly the first point is obviously being mindful of that. But then the question of why empire matters is an important one. And actually, I think, Tiago, it's interesting you mentioned Cabral, because Cabral was where I was going to approach this from. I mean, Cabral, of course, as you explored, was an agronomist. And I think it's very important to remember that fact. And in fact, our lamented late colleague here at King's, Patrick Chabal, that was one of the aspects of Cabral's career which most interested him. I know from having talked to him about it. And this is an important fact when we consider why empire matters. Empire was seen to be deeply connected, as you said, Tiago, to environmental factors and the transformation of the environment, coming back to one of Sujit's points, through the economic transformations of that and the iterations that capitalism went through from the early modern through to the modern period. Cabral recognized that relationship, and so clearly there is a relationship there. And if you look at there's been a lot of work done in the Caribbean on the relationship between the sugar plantation and environmental degradation in the Caribbean islands, but also in the area around Salvador. So we know that aspects of environmental degradation and aspects of accumulation of economic value were connected through the long history of the Portuguese Empire, right from the start of the sugar plantation system through to the era of Amilcar Cabral, in the mid-20th century. And so that, but then of course the question arises, what might be distinctive about the Portuguese case and compared to the other empires? I think it's absolutely right to put it into dialogue, as you said, Katia, with other world empires and think about that question. I don't necessarily have an answer to that, and I think I'm often perhaps better at providing questions than answers, but I think we can at least identify some of the key problems. I think the mini ice age, to come back to another point you make, Katia, is a very significant one, and you said, as you noticed, that I was agreeing the point of disagreement came around the relationship between the mini ice age and human interaction. Of course, there is a theory published by archaeologists from Colombia that the mini ice age was connected to the demographic decline in the Americas, the construction of a carbon sink, and the impact that that had on global temperatures. Now, of course, that's quite a contested theory. I'm not really coming down one side or the other. What I'm saying is that I think we have to be mindful of the interaction of humans and the environment, and that this is actually and often has been a mutually constitutive process. And the mini ice age clearly is fundamental in that. I think that's absolutely right. It hasn't really been significantly enough researched. Its relationship to empire is extremely contestable and may well be dismissed out of hand. But we shouldn't dismiss it entirely as potentially connected to it as well. I think another very important thing that Sujit raised, which I'd like to touch on, is the question of different perceptions of economic resources and their relationship of empire. You know, you talked, Sujit, about the different relationship to metals, the religious dimension of that, particularly copper in southern Africa, and that is very important, I think. You know, and of course within the Christian, the Judeo-Christian tradition, there's a religious dimension to the environment, to the world and the resources, which we don't often talk about historiographically, but clearly when we're talking about spaces of interaction, of connection, coastlines, as Amelia talked about this morning, or there are interactions of different kinds. There are the material interactions we tend to be focused on, but there are also belief systems underpinning that, and the ways in which they transformed during the Portuguese colonial era, I think, is also very, very significant. But I think I will end my 5 minutes with the question which we haven't really talked about yet in this panel, but I think is very important, which is of language and sources. What sources are we going to use to think about these questions? If we use traditional textual archival sources, we're left with a certain kind of a perspective, which is valuable, but which only will tell one side of one particular aspect of a story. Of course, Judith Carney, who Tiago talked about, was a geographer. We have Africanists such as Eda Fields Black, who's used historical linguistics, and they offer very different approaches into this relationship between humans, belief systems, and environmental transformations. I mean, I think every human society transforms its environment. So I suppose the fundamental question for me would be, what is different about the transformations of environment, which this new conjunction of circumstances brings around under the Portuguese Empire, and how does that lead to the situation where by the middle of the 20th century, a figure like Cabral would see that as so fundamentally connected? And as I said, the good thing is I have said I'm not going to provide answers. I'm only going to ask questions. So.
Okay, thank you. Thanks very much, Toby. A lot of ideas for our discussion. Francisco, you close this first round.
Well, the idea of this panel was exactly to raise a significant series of questions, and I think we are progressing in that way, not in answers, but we need questions to progress. And I'm very happy to have you all here. So I have perhaps 4 or 5 issues I would like to touch. The first one has to do with Hobbes and Rousseau. I think we are still dealing with their vision, their opposite vision of communities. The vision by Hobbes, according to which the so-called primitive communities were completely defined by conflict, by war, the man as the wolf of man, and then and of course, this has a context. He was dealing with the civil war. He was in favor of some kind of Republican vision, as Quentin Skinner well analyzed, and he was interested in justifying a kind of social contract in which people would abdicate from their power and accept the sovereignty of the king against protection. The opposite vision by Rousseau 1 century later was that the so-called primitive community was harmonious. And people would produce collectively, and there was no conflict. It's a completely opposite view, and conflict arose from appropriation of land, privatization of land, and destruction of the collective possession of land. So it is a vision of, it is the foundation of an egalitarian vision of the future, and what based on this myth concerning the past. So they both had their projects, and their vision of communities served their opposite vision, both mythological, served their projects. So the problem is that we are still entangled in this kind of visions, because after all the work of anthropologists for at least 1 century or 1 century and a half, or 2 centuries already, we still have this, we are still entangled with this vision of communities. And what is interesting to me is to understand, it's one of the issues here, to understand how communities in different parts of the world access resources, how they organize management of resources, how they establish hierarchies. I remember the case of Salvador of Congo, in a certain period of time, headquarters of the King of Congo, and how on that hill, the elite, the royal court controlled the sources of water, controlled the best sections of that hill, and that raised the issue how was managed and how communities were not this harmonious vision we had from Rousseau. So I'm interested in the internal hierarchies of these communities in different parts of the world, and I'm interested also on issues of inequality, including gender equality, because I can read from the exams of our students still some harmonious and mythic visions of these communities in certain parts of the world. And then this links with settlement, because the colonial powers, and Alain Musset studied nomadic cities in Central America, because the Spaniards would build a city here and then they needed to move because they didn't know well the environment. And that's again what Katja was talking about, how the environment imposes its strength. So they were moving cities from one place to the other because they were inadequate there. And he labeled very well his work, his book, The Nomadic Cities. And we know how Batavia moved, how Goa moved, and also the other issue, which interests me, how Chinese communities in Batavia were placed in the peripheries, how in Manila also they were fought several times and they were repressed in a violent way. So how the colonial settlements were designed according to a hierarchy and how they designed, how they provoked or they created inequality. The other issue concerns empires. I am very interested, the latest volume book by Mike Savage, The Return of Inequality. He has a very interesting statement repeated all over the book, but not elaborated and not studied properly. His idea, and I agree with the idea, but I think we have to go further, is that we are completely misled by nation states. After the First World War, it doesn't elaborate this, but I could add, after the First World War and the disruption of the Ottoman and the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, historians thought that it was the time for the nation state, and they needed to study the nation state. But in time, empires reconstituted themselves or are trying to reconstitute themselves. Nowadays, it's very visible how the Chinese recovered from a long period of decline. How in India, I can only explain the policies of Modi as a reconstitution of empire, now under the Hindu predominance in his own nationalist vision, and how Russia tries to reconstitute empire, how we have the United States empire, and we can arguably also have a soft European empire. So nowadays, empires are quite important, and I think they were very important in the past for several reasons, because they created connections, they created patterns of behavior and of management of space. And going back to where I started, communities, I think there is quite a lot of work nowadays on development of land empires. I recall our colleague here at King's, Alexandra Vukovic. She has a fantastic program on nomads under the Russian, the Mongol, and the Chinese empire, and how these empires really disrupted in a completely violent and abusive way all these communities until nowadays, and they go on. And what is going on with the war? Well, I'm not going to extend on that. The war in Ukraine, the quantity of soldiers recruited in the middle of these nomadic and peripheral communities is overwhelming. So, but that's another side of the story. So what is interesting to me is to understand this long-term human side of relation with space, which empires create, and also how, and going back to Tiago and his observation concerning the colonial metropolis, I couldn't agree more, because one of the, and I mentioned this with the introduction to this symposium, you have a dissolution. This issue of environment represents also dissolution of the dichotomy between metropolis and colonies, which raises the issue more recently, but I think there is an historical background of decolonizing the metropolis. Nowadays it's clear, but in the past, this dissolution of dichotomy, I think it's also clear. It's also part of the same pattern with different relations of strength, with different relations of power, but it's all part of the same dynamic and the same unit. And finally, the last remark concerns interdisciplinarity. This, I was always in favor in history of comparison with the environment. There's no doubt that what we need to do, but also interdisciplinarity is completely obligatory in this area. We are completely dependent on biologists, on anthropologists, on all areas of sciences concerning the environment and humanities. And I was discussing with Nancy Narrow about the culture of environment and the cultures and the cultural impacts we can study around it. So all areas are involved in this issue. So for me, the environment is an ideal area of study, because it's by definition interdisciplinary and comparative.
Okay, thank you, Francisco. A little bit more, but well, it's the boss, so. Well, I think we at this stage, we are here more to raise questions and to discuss that questions that can make a kind of research agenda, than to answer those questions. And this said, I think we have collected so far in this first round a lot of good ideas and good thoughts. And if you agree, we should give now the floor to the colleagues that are here with us or here with us. Yes, the others cannot speak. Those that are following us in the YouTube cannot speak. Okay. So, do you agree with this? I suppose you all would like to comment here or there the talks of your colleagues, but we could go right now to the audience. So the floor is open. Okay, I take the name Diogo. Although you please introduce yourself when you speak.
Yeah, Diogo Cabral, Trinity College Dublin. Well, thank you guys so much for this. Well, thank you, Francisco, for putting this all together. Yeah, well, thinking out loud, right? That's the spirit of all this. I very much welcome Katja's comments on the relation between environment and empire, right? Because that's something I've been trying to do in a way for a long time now, to rethink the ontology that we use to look at these problems, right? Because when we speak of the environmental impact of environment, there is an implication there, right? There is an assumption, more precisely, that these are two things, that these are things. These are finished things, separate things that have external relations, right? And what if we try to tell the stories in which it's hard to imagine, it's hard to find words to deal with this, but in a way, there is no environment, right? Because the environment is perspectival. I do understand what you said about trying to pursue, past people's understanding of the environment, right? But I would take a step further and say there is no environment because it is totally perspectival. The flies flying over here, they have their own environment, right? Stray cats have their own environment. The rats feeding on urban dumps have their own environment, right? What is the objective environment, right? So, and with the Portuguese Empire, when you think about it, it is a human enterprise made in relation with the non-human world, step by step. I'm thinking, for example, when the Portuguese arrived in Brazil in 1500, right? They very readily identified pau-brasil, Brazil wood trees, right? Why was that? Well, several factors, but one of them was that Caesalpinia was and is, right, a pan-tropical genus, right? They were used to extract other Brazils from Southeast Asia, right? So that the biogeography of the genus, which of course unfolded in geologic time, was a factor shaping the commodification, the very first commodification of Brazilian landscape, right? Anyway, I wanted to just throw out this provocation, reacting to Katja's comments, for us to try to rethink the very ontology of our history, right? What is environment? What is empire? Can we perhaps deal with this as an action rather than an inner action?
Interaction. Okay, thanks, Diogo. José Augusto.
In fact, I will do some follow-up here from what Diogo said. I think the word environment is not that important. What is really important is to bring the word to a historical analysis. The word, is diversity, the beings, the water, the soils, everything, to bring the word. Not to write a history as if we were above the word, which sometimes happens, many times happens. And environment is a word that has its own history, but became a kind of synthesis, synthetic word or synthetic concept to talk about all the world we are living with. No? And it's not a good word because it's a little bit close, the idea of environment, as if we have we and the environment. Chin Ingold, the anthropologist, he said he preferred the word zones of interpenetration, which students there in Brazil also consider very funny because in Brazil, in Portuguese, zones are houses of prostitutes. I don't know if in Portugal also, in Portugal it's Portuguese, but I don't know why in Brazil, zonas has this meaning. So zonas de interpenetração, né? The students also consider very funny. But gives a sense of a more open and more dynamic sense. But in fact, the word became a synthesis to talk about work because, of course, in the past, environmentalists did not exist. Environment, they did not use the word environment, but they were talking about animals, plants, soils, rains, these things that today we synthesize it in the environmental agenda. I think that's the point. Also, the race of environmental history is a way of talking about bringing the world to history. And sometimes it's good for fluency of reasoning, of writing, because we can do a kind of a retrospective qualification using the word, projecting the word environment to the past. Because otherwise we would have to talk animals, plants, microorganisms. So it's a typical, what you can, this concept of retrospective qualification, I think is very good. This is what we are doing. In fact, historical writing, historical analysis is based a lot on retrospective qualification all the time.
I think it's Amelia Polonia here.
Thank you.
Susanna at the back.
So we are just thinking loudly, and the challenges were quite inspiring. I would begin with the issue of the actors and how we, actors of the present, put questions to the behaviors or the feelings or the perceptions of the actors of the past. But I will go beyond that. First, I cannot understand history rather than the history of our own times in the sense that it's leveled by our own concerns that we really put questions to the past. But that's not only that, is that there are entities that became actors of history, for instance, the oceans. The Atlantic or the Indian Ocean or whatever, they are dealt with as historical actors. And so we can see the changing of history, looking at those spaces or entities as if they were human, or usually we do deal with humans. So I think the paradigm shift is even, I mean, more significant than that. We are dealing with oceans or the monsoon, for instance, system as if they were actors in history. Then why does empire matters, and why does European maritime empires matter? I would put forward just two things, mobilities. Because they are maritime, because they connect in a very short time, in historical times. Not only biological movements and species or diseases are circulating, but people. And for instance, the forced labor. There are studies from archaeology in Africa that clearly says that they are ecosystem transformations in the inner Africa because of the movements of slaves, the massive ones, and nucleation of others that are going to reframe their concept of community, as Francisco was saying. And then we think about North American natives, and we can see the pressure exerted for these new frontiers and how it's going to change life systems and obviously the occupation of the environment. And then, okay, Katja, we spoke today mostly about the shores impact and the Atlantic or the ocean impacts, but more than that, mining in South America, Latin America has been object of abundant studies in environmental history or sugar production or tobacco, or so the monoculture is going really against property to be transformed and in a very short period of time. I agree with you in lots of things, and I'm very critical about Crosby ecological imperialism, I have to say. I'm not popular for that in many places. But even so, when you put this question, why does it matter? I would find immediate explanations why it matters to be here today discussing it. And if we come to the 18th, 19th, 20th century, and we think of Africa, and we think about the huge explorations of cocoa or coffee, or we do understand why it matters, because even if in the early moderns, the effect, the impact are not so visible when we come to the 19th century, and the logic of the imperialism, of colonialism is the same, except amplified. The capitalism system and economic markets have more or less the same laws, except amplified, so we can understand how it matters. Obviously, different empires certainly have different impacts, ecological not. But anyway, I'm just interacting and thinking loudly and trying to understand what does it matter being today here speaking about it. And obviously, if we think of the codfish levels of the predation or whales or whatever, we do understand that there is a long-term impact that is connected with this kind of European colonialism.
Maybe we shouldn't think the word impacts as only negative impacts. There are good impacts, bad impacts, good impacts, and empires contribute to both of them. Well, I have Koldo. Koldo wants to say something. If I'm not wrong, there is no one else so far. Okay, you too. Okay, Koldo first.
Do I need to introduce myself or?
Yes,
No,
yes, for our colleagues that are online. Yeah, and the public.
From King Juan Carlos University, Madrid. Okay. Okay. Three very fast things. Perhaps I'm too young to talk. In Spain, I will be regarded as too young to talk, but here it seems that it's possible. First one, we should talk about nature, not environment, in early modern period. Nature, when they talk about nature, Baltasar Gracián, Camões, and the others, nature has a double meaning of the God, the element created by God in the executive literature, as well as the internal perspective or moral basis of the humans toward a moral virtue and the perception of nature. It has this double meaning. Environment is a American or perhaps German word. Concerning the concept, I think Pocock, Skinner, or here in Cambridge, and others have done a great deal on this. Second, very fastly, Francisco, I think you mentioned Svetlana Alexeyevich, the writer, the Russian writer. Did I listen correctly? Svetlana Alexeyevich. She wrote a book very recently. It's called the Homo Sovieticus.
Yes.
How the Russian Empire, undercover with the idea of Soviet Union, created a behavior that's called the Homo Sovieticus, and how they gather all of them in the kitchen to discuss politics. they gather in the kitchen and they switch on the radio and TV to avoid being heard by the secret services. Even nowadays, we are discussing of the colonialism and post-colonialism. So I think the empires still has some importance even in our current vocabulary. And thirdly, well, another point, the national liberal states has created such idea even on how we manage the nature, that still the ideas on deforestation are coming from wrong perception of the discourse of the 19th century in terms of forest and so on. And last to finish, you mentioned Rousseau and Hobbes. There is a middle way that usually is put aside, which is Locke, John Locke, and the idea of the state of nature and the human. Just to thank you.
Okay, thank you. And now our colleague there. Would you introduce yourself, please?
Yes, Juliet Perkins, King's College London.
Okay.
At the moment, I'm a research fellow. My background is literature, so I'm really speaking beyond my comfort zone. But I wanted to just raise, it's not really a question, but to raise that very modern aspect of empire, which is war, bellic, and the effect on the environment. It's not just the Portuguese Empire of conquest. I'm talking specifically of bombs and mines you see in Asia. And in fact, there's the research and there's attention being made by Geneva and all the rest of these organizations of what happens to the environment in a heavily mined area, which has been left as humans can't walk on it. And what happens to the regeneration in different parts of the world? And the question, of course, is whether it's positive in some aspects or purely negative in terms of the human environment that nature is denied to its former inhabitants. If you look at it from the natural environment point of view, where no human can tread, you have vast tracts of land, say Cambodia, Angola, of course, is a point where nature will take back something for good or for worse. And I don't know where that fits in with the idea of empire at all, but I just wanted to raise that very specific warlike aspect, which is modern technology, and didn't apply so much to the Middle Ages. The bodies were hacked to pieces and, decayed into the ground. But we're facing something in the 21st century, which is particularly man-made with long consequences, but it may have a different aspect on the natural environment than that we thought at the time.
Okay. Thank you very much. I think we could now go back to the table mates here for yeah, and make a second round. I invite you to comment each other's or follow up some of the questions raised by our colleagues here in the room. So let's follow the same order. First, we start with Sujit Sivasundaram. Would you like to add something to your first?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, sure. I mean, there's actually a lot to say, but I didn't hear you say 5 minutes earlier. By the way, I thought it was 10. So I'm sorry about going on a bit too long earlier. Yeah, I mean, on words. I mean, my training is in the history of science originally, and so I totally agree at one level that we need to historicize the word environment and historicize the word nature, and understand where these words come from. That's a really, really important point that has been made in the audience. However, we need to ensure that the words we replace them with are not Eurocentric categories. So I think the danger here in the conversation is saying nature is better than environment, is that we're still kind of returning to a Euro intellectual history to justify nature rather than environment. And I'd rather feel that there's no one category that's going to work across this whole field. And so rather than getting caught up in which word, I think we need to be quite skeptical at one level about the words and critical in terms of historicizing the words: environment, nature, human, animal, plant, whatever. All these categories need to be historicized and understood historically, but also understood in relation to cross-cultural kind of engagements, where people, as I said earlier, might have very different meanings attached to particular categories to the ones that Europeans and Judeo-Christian explorers and imperialists had. So I think that makes it really complicated. At the same time, I think it's very urgent, given what's going on in the world, for us to be able to talk about the whole story as well. And so when we have historicized, I think we're going to have to unfortunately go with some of these categories in the stories that we tell or the histories that we write. So I think it's that kind of traditional kind of problem of the impossibility of the category and anachronism, but also the context into which we need to sort of present our research, given the present moment that historiography operates in. On posthumanism, yeah, I totally agree on that, because I've been writing in that vein. I would say that there's no singular Indian Ocean, there's no singular ocean. You know, there are different creatures, there are different ecosystems. What's going on in the Persian Gulf environmentally is very different to what's going on in the mangrove swamps of East Africa, is very different to the island geographies and forests of Southeast Asia. So I think we do need to have a sense really of the multiplicity of the thing we're calling environment in this conference, and the way it actually exerts pressures on the human in various ways. And really the history includes all of those other kind of material contexts in addition to the human history. That's not to mean that we attribute absolute agency to nature, or that we reduce our history down to nature or the environment, but rather that actually we are able to incorporate in our analysis, including through use of archaeology, science, biology, as has been stated, methods which actually kind of allow us to not simply write a human-centered view of impact on the environment, but one which actually sort of, gives space for all of these other life forms, which are clearly, I mean, I've recently been reading on sea cucumber and trepang, and, it's really very, very slippery in lots of ways, because, it just kind of evades all of these trading practices and empires and moves towards China from Aboriginal communities in Australia. So in the 18th century, the 19th century. And so I think it's kind of, the way it's particular creatures and life forms have pathways which we can't reduce down, but which still are important to understanding the human condition. Very quickly, I want to say inequality is really, really important. I'm really glad that Francisco mentioned it. And I would add into inequality gender and ethnicity and class. I think, work, the way work has been forged around environmental conditions. So one way to kind of distinguish, and here I respond partly to Katya, the European imperial tradition is the plantation complex. And the plantation complex, for instance, of pepper, which is fascinating to think through the Portuguese story here, as it moves from South India to Southeast Asia. There's really interesting work on what that does to gender relationships in Southeast Asia for women and enslaved women. So Barbara Andaya Watson and so forth. So I think that actually kind of thinking about this not only as a history of the non-human, but actually how really fundamental relations of humans in terms of inequality come to be at this interface of work in a particular way in European imperial context, given the rise of the plantation complex, certainly war and plunder and capitalism. It's not to romanticize non-European empires, but to say that this is a particular pathway, which is not specific to the Portuguese, but which is specific to European imperialism.
Thanks, Sachin. Now, Katya.
Yes, thanks, Zé Vicente. So let's see if I can gather my thoughts. I think there is a radical difference between colonialism and imperialism. And I do not believe that imperialism is just the scaling up of colonialism. These are two different, very, very different beasts, and they do very, very different things. It's not that one is better than the other or benigner than the other. This is not a judgment call, but they're very different things. And in that sense, I think that the approaches that Sujit and Tiago, and partially what you stated, Toby, makes sense. But there is the 19th century and mostly the post-revolutionary period makes a difference. And that links to the second point I would like to make, is that for me, empire is not a bunch of, it's not 12 ships leaving Lisbon going down the west coast of Africa, and at some point there's a couple of guys that cross the Cape of Good Hope. This is not empire. These are guys in ships. And this is not what we're talking about. even if they're fishing and even if they're capturing resources along the way, this is not empire, for me at least. So for me, empire is something totally different that comes in very forcefully. And in that sense, perhaps contrary to what you might have expected from the questions I've raised so far, I do believe that empire matters in relation to environment and to a bunch of other things, but empire is not simply defined as people taking to ships and in their small numbers doing specific things. Empire is a social and political structure project that is contingent and very often does not go according to plan, but it has a huge impact on ecosystems, and ecosystems include social systems across the globe. So I think that I would like to clarify that. What I find particularly interesting and challenging, if I may give two examples, very concrete, I think to make my point clear, I think, is that I think there is a difference between what happens after, say, the beginning of the 10th century in Iberia, where the future Portuguese and Spanish polities are conquering the peninsula to the south, where there has been, by medievalists, clearly a tone that there is environmental impacts, that there are all types of changes, there is interactions, there's destruction, all of the things that we see later on in empire, but somehow we have encased that in the historiography very poorly as state building, and particularly in the Portuguese historiography, which always sees the Portuguese state as somehow an eccentric development. However, we speak radically differently from the Portuguese colonial impact overseas, because that's what we're talking about, not the colonial impact in Portugal, but overseas. So for me, it would be really interesting then to understand what is it about empire that makes depredation or impact, positive or negative, so much different than the reconquest, which is also to a certain extent a type of landed expansion, is the expansion of a state, by which definitely colonial build-up is not the expansion simply of a state. It needs to be more than that if we're thinking that we're talking about different things. And I think that my last point is about extraction. Yes, of course, Amelia, cacao, rubber, for the 19th century, sure. Sugar, I'm not sure. I think Europeans had a very particular way of exploiting sugar. However, we know of other peoples who did produce sugar in a very different way to the largest consuming market in the world, right? China is the largest consuming market in the early modern world. They are the ones that consume the most sugar. They're two largest producers of sugar to be consumed in China. The first one are the Persians, the Dutch bring it in. The second are actually the Japanese. And the Japanese produce sugar without A, depleting their islands, B, using enslaved labor, and C, expanding the state, except taking over the island of Hokkaido. Now, the question is, why, and then we get back to the empires, why do empires matter? Well, empires matter because they somehow accrue the social and the political project power to be able to deplete islands in the Caribbean, in Suriname, in Brazil, without no checks and balances. But this has to do with the fact that Europeans are extremely badly equipped as societies to put up with change. Because what the Japanese have accrued by 1700 is that they have crossed the Malthusian trap. They're not trapped in Malthusian premises anymore. They can feed themselves. So we cannot. So this pressure to go out and to take over has something to do with actually of not being in the forefront, actually of being in the worst place that you can be, overpopulated in a population, in a continent that cannot feed your people. Look at the Dutch, right? The great efficient Dutch people, they do not produce cereals, they cannot eat. This is the basis of mercantile capitalism in Northern Europe. So it is, how do you say it in Portuguese? We have a saying for this, a necessidade faz o engenho. You know, merchant capitalism, European merchant capitalism comes from the need to answer to shortcomings in European systems. Oh, I have absolutely no doubt that empire matters. The question for this room, I think, is that I think we should be listing why does empire matter? And we're not doing that.
Not because they
So I'm not doubting that
bad
it does.
guys, but just because they were desperate.
No, well,
You're-
no, that's not the point. The point is empire is not defined by half a dozen of people that gets into ships. That is not what empire is. So what is it that empire is that makes a difference for environmental matters, whether it's depletion or not?
So very quickly now, I would like to ask Tiago Saraiva to say something else to add to your first thoughts. We are a bit running out of time. We have about 8 to 9 minutes. So
You can talk more.
Okay, more 1 minute or other places. Okay, Tiago.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I'll try to be brief. And so many questions here. Also not solving the ones that I'm just bringing more. I'm not solving them. So there is, I think, an important issue that we've been discussing, which is how to deal with the multiple ontologies that empires bring together. And so reflecting a little bit on what how Sujit reacted and to the questions by Diogo. These are I think that for historians, there is this sense that when we tend to account for these multiple ontologies, we don't know what to do with the narratives, you know, how to actually produce an historical narrative, where is the causation, without falling and really avoiding this kind of transferring to non-humans the old ways that we used to think about agency in humans. So what I'm trying to say here is that a narrative, the way that Crosby, for example, gave us, it's just replacing an imperial vision of how humans act from an imperial vision on how nature acts, on what he thinks nature is, and to avoid those. So I think that we have to be really reflexive, as we've been trying to do here with the notion of environment. I think that these languages like environment, impact, languages like management of resources, in this way lead us into a kind of ahistoricism that actually doesn't recognize the problems of multiple ontologies. And we do have historians who have offered us examples of how to write histories that acknowledge those multiple ontologies. Of course, we have Sujit here in this book of Waves Across the South. We also have, I don't know, for me, like an example is Pablo Gomez and the Experiential Caribbean. And I think it's not a coincidence. And here I will just also make a call for the contributions from historians of science. I normally don't present myself as an environmental historian. I use the history of science definition I normally present myself as an historian of science as Sujit. And the advantage here of the history of science is recognizing, of course, that these notions of environment are really contentious. And it really matters that people are thinking differently when we are talking about cinchona or malaria. It really matters that we're talking about bark, or if we're talking about quinine. So in terms of chemists, if it's a chemical notion of what is the agency of the cinchona tree, or if this is the mosquito, and all those things actually matter a lot on how we envision that. And so actually that's where this history of science, I think, has something to contribute to the or the history of knowledge more broadly to environmental history, that these things, that makes very obvious that these things are not ahistorical actants. And just to finish with the challenge for interdisciplinarity, which again I think it's undoubtedly, we learned a lot from archaeologists. We learned a lot from biologists. Environmental history invites that. And then I'm all for that. And I've learned a lot from them. But there is always that, namely with, I found that I speak from personal experience, namely with biologists, I have had many more problems in actually considering or making it, being able to pass this idea that actually the synchronotry was not the same thing from what is today and what was it 500 years ago, and that it really does matter when we think about the synchronotry in different terms. So to just identify, to talk about the environment in those very, in terms of contemporary terms, that was Crosby's project. That was Crosby's project, right? We now know these things about the environment, and now we know what the environment is, and then we put these things make them historical actors. And yeah, I think it's more complicated and more interesting than that. And namely, when we do that, we rewrite a kind of imperial history, and we are being imperialists ourselves.
Thank you, Diego. Now, Toby.
Thank you, Joseph. Okay, I think there are two trains of thought in this discussion. The first is around the structures of historical thought, how the categories that we are using, I really agree with Sujit that we have to interrogate those and we have to contextualize those. And I'm going to explore that through an example. So, if you look at the historiography of West Africa, economic historiography of West Africa is founded on the idea that there was lots of empty land in West Africa. Now, where does this idea of empty land come from? Of course, this idea was then fundamentally critiqued by Hassan Sarr in his, I think it was a 2016 book about Senegambia, and where he pointed out that what was seen by outsiders as empty land was not seen as empty at all by Senegambians who saw that land as rich with spiritual life. Where does the concept of empty land come from? The concept of empty land actually really comes from figures like Thomas More, his Utopia, the idea that there is a legitimate right of occupation of land and use of land, which is not being used by native, in the case he's writing about in Utopia, really Native Americans. And then you have a feedback loop over several centuries where, because then land in the Americas, because of the demographic collapse, does become vacant and empty, you have a feedback loop of members of European empires expecting to find empty land, seeing that as a justification for occupation and expropriation of that land, and then creating sources about the empty land, which you see into the 20th century with colonial administrators in Gambia talking about the empty land, which is then being exploited for the purposes of the British Empire. So there is fundamentally an ideological framework and construct there, which feeds right the way through the historiography of West Africa and ends up with this concept that wealth is in people and not in land, which you find in figures like John Thornton, and that fundamentally shapes the entire way, entire categories with which people look at that. And it comes back, of course, to the point of land and the way in which land is contextualized and the way in which these categories and concepts shape the entire way in which thought happens. So there's that one example, I think, speaks to the fact when we're talking about concepts like environment, concepts like empire, concepts like land, we really do have to understand the different inflections of meaning that those categories have and their historical contextualization. Why does this matter in terms of environment and empire in the Portuguese Empire? I think it matters a lot because, of course, ultimately control of land is related to a political dimension. We see this, of course, in European empires. We also see it in historiography of West Africa, where, in fact, it was in oral histories smiths who were able to tame the spirits of sacred forests, who were then able to develop a political dimension. And there are many Smith kings in West African history. So spiritual dimensions were linked to political dimensions. And those dimensions began to shift in the 19th century when sacred forests began to be cut down. Those spirits disappeared from a lot of West African perceptions of history and politics in relation to control, as in the Senegambian context, Islam became more powerful, and then, of course, European empires with different perceptions. So fundamentally, there is always a political dimension to the control of land. And the question arises, therefore, how that, so that the second aspect, there's the structure of thought, and then there is actually the relationship that these transformations had to empire, and it is in the political dimension, control of land, the relationship that has to control of people, that I think the role of the Portuguese Empire and other empires, European empires, lies in, coming back to Sujit's point, the relationship this all has to transformations of equalities and inequalities.
Thank you. Now, Francisco.
Well, I'm glad that Sujit touched the issue of gender inequality, because I had left it for the second round. And I think it's crucial, not only at the level of communities, to understand better management of space, management of access to resources, division of labor. So all these at the community level, you can see the gender differences and gender inequality, and also how the Europeans expanded and how gender had an influence in that kind of expansion. So I think we have to do more work on that. Second, the issue of colonialism and imperialism raised by Katia. I think it's a very interesting issue, and we could organize a session only on that subject. But well, we have just try to be brief on this. We have the Greek model of colonialism, sending new communities, splitting from the old cities. We have the Roman model of imperialism, and we have so aggregating new territories and creating, at the end, quite generously, a certain sense of citizenship, and attributing after the 4th century citizenship to peoples subordinated in territories, and the Chinese model of aggregating successively territories and in a certain way transforming all new ethnicities, or most part of them, with the exceptions in Central Asia, into Han ethnicity. It's quite interesting because you have a huge percentage of people claiming to be Han. So it's a success of several millennia of integration and imperial drive. But the only thing I think I disagree with Osterheimel and Sebastian Conrad is with they have both excellent work, but they only work on the late 19th and 20th century. I think I agree there is a completely different scale, but before you have the early modern empires, and I think in some cases you have a dilution of this dichotomy, because I agree that what happened in Iberia was a process of colonialism, but also imperialism, of absorbing new other cities, of absorbing territories, is both. So it is, and you have the internal European colonialism, and you have the dissolution of dichotomy between metropolis and colonies. So we can go quite far with this reasoning. And finally, war. I'm sensible to this reasoning by Juliet on war. It is curious because all the estimates about the environment impact of many, well, car pollution, flight pollution, all this is more or less estimated. There's one area which was not estimated by United Nations agencies, which was war, because the United States opposed. So, and war and experiments with war, they create a lot of damage to the environment, as we can see every day. So I think war is a significant issue because of the scale we have it nowadays, because of the materials which are used nowadays. So it's a completely different scale. But from a historical point of view, I think it's an issue worth investigating.
Thank you, Francisco. Thank you all. I think we have collected a lot of insightful ideas, proposals, and topics for discussion and for research. So, in my opinion, mission accomplished. Thank you all of you in the table and in the audience, and we close for now this panel. Thank you.
Não, estava.